Hi, I'm Gary. We're going to talk about narrative budgeting and church renewal. Before the pandemic, I might have just called this simply narrative budgeting. I'd have stressed the importance of telling our stories when we ask people to join with us and how a normal accounting budget won't do that. They'll want to know what we're doing, and if they want to see figures, they'll want to see how they support our ministries. That is, what are our stories, what are we really doing, and what does each of those missions cost? That's the meaning of narrative budgeting, storytelling with numbers, which some call missional budgeting. Now let's have a look at our presentation. Our church is living in perilous times, but what is the pandemic doing to us? Well, this is not a time to retreat. This is a time to grow, a time to renew. But growth begins with telling our story. No, not that story. That's boring. That's just a line item budget. Something more like this, a narrative budget. A line-by-line budget doesn't tell much of a story. So let's look at a simple example. This line item budget isn't going to tell anyone much. Who cares what the church spends on administration, or utilities, or insurance? Sure, some bits of the story are shown. There's worship, there's a line for education, a line for planning. But how much does this tell us really? We need to know more than that. What are we really doing? So let's look at a simple United Church example of a narrative budget. This one has 4 ministries. Worship ministry, about a third. They speak of weekly worship and special celebrations that are a major focus in their congregation. Second is learning ministry, about a quarter, and here they emphasize church school for children and youth, adult studies, and monthly movie discussion group. And there's caring ministry, over 16%, where we come to know each other deeply, celebrate and mourn together, and offer supports in the ups and downs of everyday life. The fourth is reaching out. They'll know we are Christians by our love. It's about love for people beyond our membership. So what would be your ministry areas? Here there is worship ministry, learning ministry, caring ministry, reaching out ministry. Would you have 4 or would you have more? And how would you describe them? This shows us the difference a narrative budget can make. To begin the process, you have to know your mission. It tells you where you want to go and what you want to do with that budget. So let's get that process started. How do you get started with your narrative budget? First, you have to know why you're doing it. That's the mission of your parish. Let's first look at some examples from different churches. New Hope Christian Fellowship says to present the gospel of Jesus Christ in such a way that turns non-Christians into converts, converts into disciples, and disciples into mature, fruitful leaders who will go into the world and reach others for Christ. Gateway Church, to bring people to Jesus and membership in his family, develop them to Christ-like maturity, and equip them for their ministry in the church and life mission in the world in order to magnify God's name. A place in Alaska, reaching out to the world, preaching to the unsaved, teaching the saved to serve. Every parish will say it differently. How do you say it? Or if you're just starting, how would you put it? The simplest way is to base it on 2 questions and 4 ministries. How does God want to work through you, and what ministries are you called to serve? The 4 basic ministries are worship, formation, caring, and reaching out. Your narrative budget should revolve around your core ministries. Depending on how thorough you want to be, there are 4 further elements of your mission you could include. There's vision, goals, core values, and strategies. Let's look at them in a little more detail. Vision, how will you pursue your mission? Core values, what you hold dear. Your goals are the actions that you need to take, and your strategies are how will you take those actions. To do a more complete job, hold a vestry meeting, compose your mission statement, compose these 4 elements, and prepare them for inclusion in your narrative budget. Your narrative budget must also be set in a clear context. It's meant to portray the life of a community in service to God's mission, how the generosity of the people makes a difference in the life of the parish and beyond. It's meant to tell the story of what the money does rather than where the money goes. That we do not give money to the church so much as we give money through the church. And it shows how generosity impacts your community and empowers your people to work for God's mission in our world. How the congregation spends its time, its talent, and its treasure. Let's look at an example of how some of these elements can be fleshed out. Here's one from Hickston Methodist. They start with their mission statement, partnering with God to transform the world by offering help, hope, and healing through Jesus Christ. Then there's their basic pitch. Make your commitment to lay the foundation for future ministry by supporting the new building addition that will focus on children's ministry. So that's their project. Then there's a further statement. All aspects of our church seemingly have grown this year, maybe not in numbers, but in spirit and dedication to the purposes to which we have committed ourselves as Christians. Now let's look at the ministries in our example. First of all, there's Pastoral Ministry. They describe it as how they lead, nurture, and embody Christian discipleship. They help people grow, and they show pastoral care. What about your parish? What would you include? The next is worship and music. They point out that they provide inspiring worship and they have a choral ensemble as part of a mature music program. I would put percentages on these. Now, what would you include here? Mission and outreach. They say how they extend the hope and love of Christ to a world in need, and they have an interfaith homeless network. What do you think for your parish? Christian formation, that's largely education. They call it a pathway for people to nurture faith and grow, and they mention their nursery and preschool and their young adults and adults programs. What would you include here? Administration, that's an important part. You have to have support for congregational activities, and they list the kind of supports they have there: communication, stewardship, general office, etc. What about your church? And facilities, you have to have a building. You have to show that you have the space and amenities for parish activities and show how much that's going to cost. What would your case be? So how would your ministries line up? And next, how would you rewrite these ministries in a time of full or partial quarantine? Now here's Pastoral Ministry. What do we have to offer nowadays? It's a nurturing ministry. We're still doing it, but in new ways nowadays. It's new ways of being church for a new era. Make it clear that the personal touch remains a sacred priority, and we find we can use the new media quite comfortably. You can still be there for them. You can listen and love on the new media. You can pray together online. You can start new conversations in new places. Dialogue is moving into virtual space. Many are already familiar, but others require a little encouragement. You know how to make them comfortable. Now, music and worship. What do we have to offer here nowadays? Worship activities in person seem diminished when they retreat into online forums, but parishioners are finding new ways of conducting worship. Music is a different story. Music online is not the same as singing together, but creative means are being found for sharing our music in virtual ways. We have online worship and prayer. We have new experiments in liturgy. We have new ways to participate, new ways to include people, and we have new people looking in. Welcome them. Show a sense of renewal and energy. Christian formation is education, and a lot of education is moving online. That said, it's not very practical for the youngest age groups. In your mission statement, speak to a spirit of innovation, values, and restoration as conditions permit. Tie into programs and courses online, offer counseling for youth to find their calling, refer parishioners to educational and informational resources. Give a sense that education is in the works and ongoing. Now, include administration and facilities too, but make it clear that all needs are being covered at minimal expense, waiting for a time of fuller operation. And for facilities, indicate that they're being well maintained during the dormant period, ready to go when things pick up. On the other hand, in times of quarantine, you can discuss what you plan to do without access to a building. So how do you go about crafting your own narrative budget? First, get the congregation and leadership thinking about the need for it, a sense of where you're going and what you're doing, and how you can get that story out to your congregation and to your neighbors. That purpose can be served by a good promotional document, one that shows how you're serving God and neighbor and through what local ministries, complete with numbers. That's what we mean by a missional budget or a narrative budget. It's designed to give a sense of something worth belonging to. Now do the preparatory work. Prepare a simple line item budget. Ask all paid personnel in each ministry to estimate how many hours they put into each line in the line item budget. Start the calculations. Show what percentage of total supplies and services each one uses. Then calculate what percentage they use of each line in the line item budget. Now come up with the figures you need. For each line of the budget, adjust until all participants add up to 100%, then add percentages across each ministry to get its proportion of the total budget. A narrative budget is best composed using a worksheet like this. Let's take a closer look at this example. The first column are the line budget categories. These are the categories used for the normal accounting budget. It includes salaries and benefits, secretary expenses, housing allowance, how much is spent on the youth group, etc. The second column is how much money in total is spent on each of these lines. The rest of it is what we need for the missional budget or the narrative budget. How much of that is spent on worship? How much of that total is spent on the wider church, on Christian development, on outreach activities, and on pastoral care? In this one, the dollar amounts are calculated first and the percentages will be calculated later. Now let's see how these figures fit together. There's a line for ministry salaries. Its total is $27,670. Of that, $11,528 are spent on worship activities. $2,306 are spent on relations with the wider church, and $46,414 are spent on Christian development or education activities. The total in column 2 is the sum of the ministries in columns 3 to 7, although only 5 are shown here. Another example, supplies totaling $2,800 goes to worship activities and $600 goes to Christian development supplies, and apparently no supplies are used up in relations with the wider church. Now total them all up along the bottom. The grand total is $74,050, but $24,737 of that is spent on worship activities, $7,836 on the wider church, $15,972 on Christian development. There you have your figures for each ministry, which are needs for the narrative budget. Now we can get going on that. Now let's summarize a bit. We started by emphasizing the importance of doing a narrative budget. This is an especially important time when we need to show where our commitments lie and how we're putting our money where our mouth is. We need the right kind of document to show that commitment, a narrative budget. The old line budgets just don't do the job. So it's all about our story, the story of our mission. We need to tell our story, the story that states our mission, what we're committed to, and what we've sent our people out to do. That shows our mission of generosity, compassion, and empowerment. It needs to be targeted to ordinary people, the seekers, the runaways, the curious, the traumatized. Now, putting it together, how do we get started? Contemplate your mission, old and new, what you've wanted to do in the past and what you want to do now. Have that Paris discussion. Your concept, your vision, your values, your ministries, talk to them, clarify them, assess them, seek engagement. Assign a team to match budget items to areas of mission. Determine each mission's percentage of budget. Putting it together, starting to produce it, compose a story for each mission area. What your money is doing, what your priorities are, calculate it all out. Add pictures, graphs, testimonials, and prayers. Research and compose an attractive presentation. Produce brochures, web pages, emails, and social media posts. So here we are. Talk to your people, gauge the interest. Schedule a showing of this video. You can find a link to it at creativestewardship.ca. I'm Gary Russell with the Diocese of Rupert's Land and the Anglican Church of Canada. And there's my email there if you want to get in touch with me. Thank you for your attention.